Ohio has a darker history than most people realize, and some of its most disturbing crimes weren't committed by men, but by women. Wives, mothers, caretakers. The people no one ever thinks to fear. In this documentary, we're counting down 7 women who turned Ohio into a crime scene. These aren't legends or ghost stories. Every case is real, every victim was real, and every one of these women was convicted and sent to prison. Some of them into history itself, as the first women Ohio ever put to death. Every case is real. Every victim was real. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. And if you're new here, subscribe and turn on notifications for a new true crime documentary every week. Rebecca Auborn, 2012. On June 21, 2012, in a rural stretch of Chippewa Township in Wayne County, Ohio, someone came upon a car sitting in the middle of a cornfield, far from any road it had any business being on. Inside was the body of a 25-year-old woman named Ashley Biggs. She was a single mother, an Army veteran, and a pizza delivery driver, and the night before she had left work on a routine delivery run and simply never come back. What investigators would eventually piece together was that Ashley hadn't been the victim of a robbery gone wrong, or a random act of violence. She had been lured to her death by a phone call, a fake pizza order, and it would take more than 7 years to prove who really made it. Ashley Biggs was, by every account, a devoted young mom. She had served her country, and in the summer of 2012 she was working as a delivery driver for a Domino's in Greene, Ohio, piecing together a living while raising her young daughter. She shared that daughter with a man named Chad Cobb. And by 2012, whatever relationship Ashley and Cobb had once had was long over, replaced by a bitter and ongoing custody battle over their little girl. That fight is the thread that runs through everything that happened next. On the night of June 20th, 2012, an order came in to Ashley's Domino's, a pizza to be delivered to an address in New Franklin, Ohio. What Ashley didn't know was that the address was a closed, empty business, and that the woman's voice on the phone had given a false name. When Ashley pulled up to that dark, vacant building expecting nothing more than a routine drop-off, Chad Cobb was waiting for her. He ambushed her, and Ashley was attacked and killed at the scene. Her body was placed in her own car, which was then driven out to that Wayne County cornfield and abandoned. When she didn't return home, the alarm went up quickly, and the next day, June 21st, her car and her body were found. Suspicion landed on Chad Cobb almost immediately, and for good reason. The custody dispute, the history of animosity between them. Investigators didn't have to look far to find someone with a motive. Cobb was arrested the very same day Ashley's body was discovered, found hiding in a wooded area behind a relative's home. In 2013, he pleaded guilty to aggravated murder and a string of related charges, accepting a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole in exchange for avoiding a possible death sentence. But investigators were certain of one thing that never sat right. Chad Cobb had not acted alone. Ashley had been lured out by a woman's voice on that phone call, and Cobb wasn't talking. For years, he refused to name the person who had helped him, and the case against that second participant simply stalled. The woman investigators came to suspect was Rebecca Auborn, known back then as Erica Lyon, who at the time of the murder was married to Chad Cobb. She was, in other words, the wife of the man in the middle of a custody war with Ashley Biggs. What finally broke the silence was betrayal, Cobb's own sense of it. In the years after his conviction, he learned 2 things that changed his calculation entirely: that Erica had moved on and become romantically involved with his best friend, and that she was, in his account, mistreating his daughter, the very child the custody fight had been about. Feeling abandoned and enraged, the man who had protected her for years finally decided to talk. Chad Cobb told investigators that Erica had been the one who placed the fake pizza order that drew Ashley to that empty parking lot, and that she had helped him afterward, following him as he disposed of the car and driving him home so he could wash away the evidence. With that, in November of 2019, Erica Stefanko was arrested. Officers waited until she had dropped her 4 children off at school, then took her into custody during a traffic stop near her home. She was charged with aggravated murder, kidnapping, and other felonies, and the case finally moved toward a reckoning. Her first trial came in November of 2020, in the strange, sparse conditions of the early pandemic. Prosecutors laid out the plan: the false name phone order, the lure to the closed business, Erica's role in the cover-up that followed. A Domino's manager recalled taking the order. Chad's mother testified that she had overheard Erica place a pizza order using a fake name. The jury convicted her of aggravated murder and kidnapping, and she was sentenced to life in prison, eligible for parole only after 30 years. But that conviction didn't hold, at least not the first time. Because of pandemic restrictions, Chad Cobb had testified against her remotely, by video from prison rather than in the courtroom. An appeals court ruled that this had violated Stefanko's rights, and in 2022 her conviction was overturned, entitling her to a brand new trial. That retrial took place in January of 2024 in a Summit County courtroom. This time, Erica Stefanko took the stand in her own defense, telling the jury she'd had no idea Cobb intended to kill anyone, that he had told her he only planned to plant drugs in Ashley's car to get her arrested and gain an edge in the custody case. She described Cobb as abusive and painted herself as a woman who had been manipulated. Her lawyers argued the whole thing was a bitter ex-husband's revenge, pointing out that no forensic evidence tied her to the scene. The jury didn't buy it. After deliberating for more than 8 hours, they again found her guilty of both aggravated murder and murder. And in early February 2024, she received the same sentence as before, life in prison, with her first chance at parole coming after 30 years, when she'll be in her 70s. The case drew heavy regional attention and was featured on national true crime programs, in part because of the chilling ordinariness of the method. There was no elaborate weapon, no criminal mastermind. There was a phone, a fake name, and an order for a pizza. A small, everyday transaction turned into an instrument of murder. For Ashley Biggs's family, the second conviction closed a wound that had been open for nearly 12 years. A young mother and veteran had answered a delivery call on an ordinary summer night, and 2 people she should have been able to trust turned that call into a trap. Anna Hahn, 1937. On August 1, 1937, in a hospital in Colorado Springs, Colorado, a 67-year-old retired shoemaker named George Obendorfer died in agony. He was a long way from home. A Cincinnati man who had traveled west, believing he was joining a woman he'd been seeing on a trip to visit her ranch. At his bedside was that very woman, who leaned over him and, in front of hospital staff, asked him his name, insisting she barely knew the man. It was a lie. She knew him well, and the reason he was dying was already in his bloodstream. A lethal dose of arsenic. The woman was Anna Hahn, and Obendorfer was not her first victim. He was simply the one whose death, far outside the world she so carefully controlled back in Ohio, would finally expose everything. By the time investigators were done, they would come to suspect Anna Hahn in a string of poisonings across Cincinnati's German community. As many as several deaths, along with cases of serious illness and paralysis, among elderly men she had cared for. She would ultimately be tried for just one of them. But to understand how one woman poisoned her way through a neighborhood for years without being caught, you have to go back to the beginning. She was born Anna Filser in Bavaria, Germany in 1906, the youngest of a large family. As a young woman, she gave birth to a son, Oscar, out of wedlock in 1925, before she ever left the country. A few years later, she emigrated to the United States, settling in Cincinnati, Ohio, in the tight-knit German-American neighborhood of Over the Rhine. In 1930, she married a telegraph operator named Philip Hahn, and brought her young son over from Germany to join her. To her neighbors, she seemed an ordinary immigrant wife and mother, warm, sociable, helpful. But beneath that surface, Anna had a serious and expensive problem. She was addicted to gambling, especially on horse races, and her losses were piling up. She needed money, steadily and in large amounts. The solution she settled on was chillingly practical. Cincinnati's German community was full of aging men, many of them widowers or lifelong bachelors, living alone, isolated by language and age, often with modest savings tucked away. Anna offered herself to these men as a caregiver and companion, a friendly German-speaking face who would cook and keep house and look after them in their final years. They trusted her, and one after another, they began to die. The pattern, laid out plainly, is unmistakable. Anna would enter a man's life, win his confidence, gain access to his money, and then he would fall suddenly, violently ill, his stomach in ruins, before dying of what doctors at the time often waved off as natural causes in an old man. Jacob Wagner, a 78-year-old, died in June of 1937. Anna had presented herself as his niece. She was no relation to him at all, and through forged and manipulated paperwork, she came away with roughly $17,000 of his life savings. Just weeks later, in July, 67-year-old George Gzelman died, and Anna collected some $15,000 for her supposed care. These were staggering sums in the 1930s, the equivalent of a small fortune today, and they vanished almost as fast as she took them, swallowed by her gambling debts. Her weapons weren't limited to arsenic either. She also used croton oil, a violently toxic substance, and the two poisons would both surface later as investigators pieced her methods together. There was at least one man who sensed something was wrong and lived to warn the world about it, though not in time. His name was George Heiss. After taking food and drink Anna prepared for him, Heiss became gravely ill, left partially paralyzed by what investigators later understood were her attempts to poison him. Growing suspicious of her, he refused to eat or drink anything more that she offered, and he forced her out of his life. Over the years, his story would be retold in a sensational, almost cartoonish form. The tale that he watched flies drop dead after landing on a drink she'd poured. The reality was grimmer and more human. A man left disabled by poison, who survived because instinct told him to stop trusting her. Heiss lived long enough to take the witness stand at her trial, appearing in a wheelchair to testify against the woman who had crippled him. But at the time, badly weakened, he never took his suspicions to the police, and so Anna simply moved on, unbothered, to her next victim. That next victim was Obendorfer, and this time, Anna made a fatal mistake. She persuaded him to travel with her and her young son to Colorado, telling him she owned a ranch out west. There was no ranch. On the train he began to sicken, and by the time they reached Colorado Springs, he was dying. When he passed on August 1st, local police were already faintly suspicious of Anna over an unrelated hotel theft, and the strange circumstances of his death pushed them to look harder. An autopsy was ordered, and it revealed what had no business being there, a heavy concentration of arsenic. Colorado authorities contacted Cincinnati, and the investigation snapped into focus. Detectives began pulling at the threads of Anna Hahn's life, and it unraveled quickly. Adding to the suspicion, her own husband, Philip, pointed police toward a bottle in their home plainly labeled as poison. It was croton oil. Investigators exhumed the bodies of men who had died in her care, and the poison was there too. They found forged financial documents, checks written in a hand the dead men themselves could never have produced, wills and transfers that all flowed in one direction, toward Anna. What had looked like a string of unremarkable deaths among the elderly was revealed as something else entirely, a methodical campaign of poisoning for profit. Anna Marie Hahn went on trial in Cincinnati beginning October 11, 1937, for the murder of Jacob Wagner, before a jury of 11 women and 1 man. It became a genuine sensation, one of the most closely watched trials the city had ever seen. Over roughly 4 weeks, prosecutors called more than 100 witnesses and built their case on the increasingly reliable science of toxicology, methodically laying out the poison in the victims and the money in Anna's hands. She insisted she was innocent and even took the stand to say so. It made no difference. The jury returned a verdict of guilty of first-degree murder without a recommendation for mercy, a distinction that sealed her fate. On November 10, 1937, the judge formally sentenced her to death. Her lawyers fought the sentence for more than a year, and Anna herself seemed to genuinely believe right to the end that the state of Ohio would never actually put a woman to death. She was wrong. After the higher courts declined to intervene, she was led to the electric chair at the Ohio Penitentiary in Columbus on December 7, 1938, becoming the first woman ever executed in Ohio's electric chair. She had proclaimed her innocence to the very last, and yet, after she was gone, a handwritten confession of some 20 pages was discovered in her death row cell, a document in which she finally admitted to the killings, took responsibility for the men she had poisoned for money, expressed bewilderment at what had driven her, and above all, worried over the fate of the son she was leaving behind. The press had already given her the names that would follow her into history: Arsenic Anna and the Blonde Borgia. Her case became a landmark, both for the sheer scale of her betrayal and for the questions it raised about crime, gender, and punishment. But beneath the sensational headlines was something simpler and sadder. Anna Hahn had sought out the loneliest, most trusting people she could find, old men with no one else to look after them, and turned their trust into a source of income. They believed they had finally found someone to care for them at the end of their lives. Instead, they had found the person who would end those lives, one poisoned meal at a time. Anna Hahn, 2022. On the evening of April 24, 2022, a man pulled into the driveway of a home in rural Auglaize County, Ohio, near Wapakoneta, to do the most ordinary thing a divorced father does: drop his 3 young daughters back off with their mother after a weekend visit. His name was Timothy Hovanec. He was 36 years old, a security engineering officer with the U.S. Department of State, and he had traveled in from Virginia for a custody hearing. He never left that driveway alive. What happened next was captured in chilling detail by the dashboard camera mounted in his own car. As the children were hurried inside the house, the audio picked up a struggle, and Timothy's voice, confused, alarmed, saying, "Did you just assault me? And get away from me." The woman attacking him was his estranged wife, Amanda, and the weapon in her hand was a syringe filled with a drug so powerful it's normally used to bring down elephants. To understand how an ordinary custody exchange in small-town Ohio turned into a homicide recorded on video, you have to go back several years and halfway around the world. Timothy and Anna Hovanec had married in July of 2012 and had 3 daughters together. Timothy's career with the State Department meant the family moved often, following his postings from country to country. One of those postings, in 2018, took them to South Africa, and it was there that the marriage began to come apart. While living in South Africa, Amanda met and began a relationship with a South African man named Anthony Theodorou. When the family returned to the United States, that relationship didn't end. In December of 2020, Amanda filed for divorce. What followed was the kind of bitter, grinding custody dispute that plays out in family courts every day. Except this one curdled into something far darker. As the proceedings dragged on, the tension escalated. By late 2021, Amanda had begun denying Timothy his court-ordered visitation with their daughters, keeping him from the children he was legally entitled to see. And somewhere in that period, according to what investigators later uncovered, Amanda stopped thinking about how to win the custody fight and started thinking about how to end her husband's life. Court records show she had been contemplating killing Timothy for as long as a year before his death. She and Theodorou first tried to arrange for someone else to do it, attempting to hire hitmen in South Africa, before settling on a method that was more personal and far stranger. The drug she chose was etorphine, better known as M99. It is an extraordinarily potent tranquilizer, a controlled substance estimated to be around 1,000 times stronger than morphine, and it's used almost exclusively by veterinarians and wildlife handlers to sedate enormous animals like elephants and rhinoceroses. It is so dangerous to people that anyone who handles it is supposed to keep an antidote close at hand, because even a drop absorbed through the skin can be fatal to a human being. This was not something Amanda could buy in Ohio, but she had a connection to a place where it could be found, South Africa, and she had Anthony Theodorou. At Amanda's direction, Theodorou obtained the drug and, in February of 2022, concealed a vial of it among jewelry and other items in a package he shipped from South Africa to Amanda, who was by then living with her mother, Anita Green, in rural Auglaize County. The murder weapon in this case didn't come from a gun store or a street dealer. It arrived by international mail, hidden in a parcel. By April, the plan was in motion, and so were the people carrying it out. Theodorou had traveled to Ohio himself. A burial site had been chosen in advance, and Anita Green, Amanda's own mother, drove Amanda and Theodorou out to dig the grave in a wooded area of the county before Timothy was ever harmed. Then they waited. When Timothy arrived that evening on April 24th to return his daughters, Amanda and her mother were there. As the three little girls were brought into the house, out of sight, the confrontation that Timothy's dash cam recorded began. According to the federal case, Amanda walked up to him and wrestled with him, knocking his cell phone out of his hand. She pulled him to the ground, put him in a chokehold, and injected the M99 into his shoulder, holding him until he stopped moving. With Timothy dead, the group set out erasing what they'd done. Amanda and Theodorou got rid of Timothy's car, driving it to Dayton, where police would eventually find it, and the three of them transported his body to that pre-dug grave and buried him. It was a coordinated effort, 3 people working together to make a husband and father simply disappear. But Timothy Hovanec did not disappear for long. His body was recovered in rural Auglaize County, near Waynesfield, that same April. And because he worked for the U.S. Department of State, the investigation quickly drew in federal authorities, and what might have been a local case became a federal one. Investigators recovered the dashcam footage, the single most damning piece of evidence imaginable, a recording of the crime as it unfolded. They traced the imported drug back through the mail to South Africa and to Theodorou. Amanda Hovanec was arrested and charged in federal court on May 2, 2022, just days after the killing. The federal reckoning came in 2024. Rather than face a jury with that dashcam video waiting, all 3 defendants pleaded guilty. Amanda admitted to a series of federal charges, including conspiring to import the drug and distributing a controlled substance that resulted in death. Theodorou pleaded guilty to his role in obtaining and importing the M99 and helping bury the body. And Anita Green pleaded guilty to being an accessory after the fact. She had known about the plan in advance and helped carry it out. On October 1, 2024, after a sentencing hearing that stretched over 6 hours in federal court in Toledo, the judge handed down the punishments, calling it plainly as bad a crime as he had ever seen or could have imagined. Amanda Hovanec was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Anthony Theodorou received 17 years, and Anita Green was sentenced to a little over 10 years for helping her daughter carry out and conceal the murder. The 3 were sent to separate federal prisons across the country. Amanda and her mother both appealed, and in February of 2026, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld their prison sentences in full, though it reversed a $2 million restitution order that had been imposed for the psychological sue of the children on narrow federal statutory grounds. For the family and colleagues who filled that courtroom, the loss was staggering. A devoted father and public servant, killed doing nothing more than returning his children after a weekend together. And the case is still not finished. In November of 2025, an Auglaize County grand jury indicted all 3 a second time, now on state charges. Amanda with aggravated murder and tampering with evidence, and Theodorou and Green each with complicity to aggravated murder. Amanda has since pleaded guilty to the state aggravated murder charge as well, while the other 2 await further proceedings, meaning that even with their federal sentences in place, everyone involved in Timothy Hovanec's death is being made to answer for it a second time in the very county where he was buried. Martha Wise, 1924. In the winter of 1924 and into the early months of 1925, in a rural farming community called Hardscrabble near Medina, Ohio, an entire family seemed to be dying from the inside out. It began at a Thanksgiving gathering when a woman named Sophie Hazel fell violently ill. Within weeks, she was dead. Then her relatives, the Gienka family, her kin, began collapsing with the same brutal stomach pains, one after another. 2 more of them would die. More than a dozen others were left sick, several of the children partially paralyzed, unable to walk. To the community, it looked like some terrible sickness sweeping through one unlucky family. It wasn't a sickness at all. Every one of them had been poisoned, deliberately, methodically, over a span of months, by one of their own. Her name was Martha Wise, and she was Sophie Hazel's daughter. Martha had been born Martha Hazel in 1883, and she'd spent her whole life in and around that same poor rural corner of Medina County. She married a farmer named Albert Wise and raised a family with him. But in 1922, Albert died suddenly, leaving Martha a widow at around 40, with 4 surviving children, a 50-acre farm to work, and, by many accounts, a deep loneliness. Even before then, neighbors had noticed something unusual about Martha, an odd, almost hungry fascination with funerals. She would attend services whether she knew the deceased or not, often weeping and wailing among the mourners for complete strangers. It was a quirk the community had long whispered about, and it would take on a far darker meaning before the story was over. After Albert's death, Martha found something that felt like a way out of her loneliness, a romance with a younger man, a farmhand named Walter Johns. To Martha, the relationship was a second chance. To her family, it was an embarrassment, an older widow taking up with a much younger man, and they made their disapproval crushingly clear. Her mother was reportedly the harshest of them all. It was known around the community that Sophie disapproved of the match, and, according to what came out later, she had gone so far as to threaten to disown her own daughter if Martha didn't end the affair. The pressure worked. Martha broke off the romance. But something in her did not let it go. Instead of grief, there was resentment. And that resentment found an outlet almost impossible to comprehend. Martha began buying arsenic, signing for it at a local drugstore, purchasing large quantities of the poison over time. Then she began putting it where her family would never think to look for it, in the things they drank. She laced the water buckets the household drew from and the coffee pots the family shared. It was a patient, invisible kind of violence, no single dramatic act, just poison slipped into the ordinary rhythms of daily life, again and again, so that the people around her sickened and died slowly, their suffering mistaken for natural illness. Her mother was the first to go. Sophie was poisoned around Thanksgiving of 1924 and died on December 13th, her death written off by doctors as stomach inflammation. At the funeral, Martha wept and wailed over the woman she had killed, just as she always had for strangers, but she didn't stop with the mother who had opposed her romance. She turned next on her aunt and uncle, Lily and Fred Gienke, and their children, an entire household. Over the following weeks, the Gienkes and their kids fell ill with the same agonizing symptoms. By February of 1925, both her aunt and uncle were dead. 4 of the Gienke children were left partially paralyzed by the poison, some of them robbed of the ability to walk. In all, across that single winter, 17 members of Martha's own family were sickened by arsenic. 3 of them died. Such a cluster of deaths and illnesses in one family could not go unexamined forever, and eventually the local authorities began to investigate. The Medina County Sheriff, Fred Rochon, started pulling at the threads, and one of them led straight to the local drugstore, where he discovered that Martha Wise had signed for repeated purchases of large amounts of arsenic. An autopsy on her aunt settled the question of how the woman had really died. Her body was saturated with the poison. Martha was brought in for questioning on March 19, 1925. At first, she reached for the excuse anyone in her position might. She'd bought the arsenic, she said, to kill rats around the farm. But under questioning, the story fell apart, and Martha confessed. She admitted that she had poisoned her family, that she had put the arsenic in the water buckets and the coffee, and that she had done it deliberately. Then came one of the strangest turns of the entire case. Asked why, Martha reached for an explanation that made headlines across the country, one that connected Daryl. It lied to the morbid habit her neighbors already knew about. She claimed she had an irresistible compulsion, a craving for funerals and the mourning that surrounded them, and that when there weren't enough deaths in the community to satisfy that urge, she felt driven to create them. Newspapers seized on it instantly, branding her the Borgia of America. Whether that bizarre motive was the whole truth, a symptom of real mental illness, or a story layered over something simpler, has never been fully settled, because underneath the sensational headline sat a far more human motive that also emerged, a bitter, wounded daughter striking back at the family, and especially the mother, who had shamed her and forced her to give up the man she loved. Despite her confession, Martha pleaded not guilty when she appeared before a grand jury on March 23, 1925, and she was indicted for the first-degree murder of Lily Ginke on April 7th. Her trial began on May 4, 1925, and became one of the most sensational proceedings Ohio had seen in that era. Her lawyers argued that she was criminally insane and that Walter Johns had been the one who ordered her to poison the family, a claim Johns flatly denied. The defense was beset by disaster and disgrace, including an accusation that they had tried to coach a witness into supporting the insanity claim, and the testimony against her was devastating. Her own 14-year-old son, Lester, took the stand against his mother and offered the single most damning detail of the trial. He recalled that Martha had explicitly warned her own children never to drink from the water buckets at the Ginke house, proof that she knew exactly what was in them. 3 of the surviving crippled Ginke children were brought into the courtroom to testify, one of them carried in on a stretcher. On May 12, 1925, after only about an hour of deliberation, the jury found Martha Wise guilty of first-degree murder. Along with the verdict, they made a recommendation for mercy, which under the law of the time spared her from a death sentence. She was sentenced instead to life in prison and sent to the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville. She was never tried for the other 2 deaths. The conviction for her aunt's murder was enough, and prison is where Martha Wise stayed for the rest of her long life, including, in the end, by her own choice. She spent nearly 4 decades behind bars, a diligent, well-behaved inmate. In 1962, at the age of 79, her good conduct earned her a commuted sentence and parole, but when she walked out, there was nowhere for her to go. The family she had tried to destroy refused to take her in, and the rest homes she approached turned her away. Within 3 days, having no other place in the world, Martha Wise asked to return to prison. And she did, living out her remaining years inside the walls of the Marysville Reformatory until her death there on June 28, 1971, at the age of 88. The woman who had once poisoned her family for the funerals it would bring ended her days utterly alone in the one place that would still have her. Daryl Sutorius, 1996. On the morning of February 19, 1996, sheriff's deputies were called to a large, expensive home on Simmis Ridge Lane in the upscale suburb of Simms Township, just outside Cincinnati, Ohio. A prominent local heart surgeon named Dr. Daryl Sutorius hadn't shown up for work, something a busy, reliable doctor simply didn't do, and his office manager, worried, had called for someone to check on him. When deputies arrived, Daryl's wife let them search the house. As they looked through the property, she went down to a room in the basement, and moments later they heard her screaming. There they found the doctor, dead, slumped on a couch with a single gunshot wound to the head and a revolver near his hand. At first glance, it looked like a man who had taken his own life, but almost nothing about that basement scene would survive scrutiny. Within days, investigators would conclude that Daryl Sutorius had not ended his own life at all. He had been murdered, and the scene arranged to hide it. And the person who had arranged it was the woman standing beside them, his wife of less than a year. Dr. Daryl Sutorius was, by every measure, a successful man, a respected cardiac surgeon in the Cincinnati area with a substantial income and 4 grown children from an earlier marriage, known as generous, especially toward his kids. In the early 1990s, after a divorce, he did what many people do when they're lonely. He turned to a dating service, hoping to find companionship. That is where he met the woman who called herself Dante. Her real name was Della. Born Della Faye Hall in 1950, she had lived many lives and worn many surnames by the time she crossed paths with Daryl. He was, in fact, her fifth husband. She had cycled through 4 marriages before him, reinventing herself along the way and adopting the more exotic-sounding name Dante. To Daryl, she presented as charming, attentive, and accomplished. She told him she had graduated from UCLA and had once owned a daycare center. Neither was true. In reality, she had never finished high school and had never held a steady job in her life, but Daryl didn't know that yet. They married in 1995 and Della moved into his comfortable world, a fine home, a Lexus, spa visits, fur coats, a life of considerable ease. The marriage curdled quickly, and the people closest to Daryl watched it happen. Della, it turned out, wanted more than comfort. She seemed to want control of everything, and she bristled at Daryl's generosity toward his own children. When she learned that he intended to pay for his daughter's wedding, she reportedly flew into a rage. The tension grew so severe and her temper so alarming that Daryl became genuinely afraid of the woman he had married. This respected surgeon grew so frightened that he began wearing a bulletproof vest around his own home, and he confided his fears to family and friends. And there was something else that should have been a warning. This was not the first husband Della had frightened. Several of her former husbands would later describe a history of threats and menace, that being married to Della could be a dangerous thing. Then Daryl began to learn the truth about his wife. He discovered the lies, the fabricated college degree, the daycare that never existed, along with a violent past and a history of threats against the men before him. Whatever love had drawn him to the dating service was gone. He cut Della out of his will and began divorce proceedings. And by early 1996 he was preparing to formally serve her with papers and have her removed from the house. In fact, he was reportedly just about a week away from doing exactly that when he died. That timing points straight at the motive. Under a divorce, especially given how briefly they'd been married, and now that he'd cut her from his will, Della stood to walk away with very little. But as Daryl's widow, she stood to inherit a great deal, an estate and assets reported to be worth as much as $1 million. Prosecutors would later say she had a deep problem with rejection. Her own sister put it more bluntly, recalling that Della's philosophy toward men had always been simple. Find a wealthy one, and when he dies, you get his money. And what almost no one knew was how ready she already was to act. Just days before Daryl's death, Della had bought a .38 caliber revolver at a gun store called Target World and had even taken a shooting lesson to learn how to use it. On the night of February 18, 1996, after an argument, Della shot her husband as he lay in the basement. Then she set about making it look like something else. She arranged his body on the couch and placed the revolver near his hand to suggest he had done this to himself, then went back upstairs to build an alibi, ready to tell the story of a wife who had slept through it all and heard nothing but a vague noise she'd taken for part of a dream. The next morning, when deputies arrived, she played the part of the shocked and grieving widow discovering her husband's beaux die. The problem for Della was that the evidence refused to cooperate with her story. When investigators and the coroner examined the body closely, the fatal wound didn't fit a self-inflicted death. Daryl had been shot from behind the right ear, at an angle that made no sense for a man taking his own life. There was no note, and gunshot residue tests came back positive on Della's own hands and clothing, showing that she was the one who had recently fired a gun, not the sleeping wife she claimed to be. Then came one of the most extraordinary turns in the entire case. Della's own mother picked up the phone and called the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office. She told detectives plainly that her daughter was a dangerous liar, that Daryl's death was absolutely not a suicide, and that she was certain Della had murdered her own husband. When a killer's own mother is guaranteeing investigators that her daughter is guilty, the walls close in fast. Della had actually been taken into custody that first day, initially on an unrelated matter after deputies searching the home found a supply of cocaine, and released on bail the next morning. But the investigation was accelerating. Detectives traced the murder weapon back to her purchase at Target World, and as the forensic results came in, the picture became undeniable. On February 27, 1996, Della Sutorius was rearrested, this time for the murder of her husband. Her trial took place in the spring of 1996 in Hamilton County. Della chose not to take the stand. Her lawyers argued that the state had never truly disproven the possibility that Daryl had taken his own life and raised legal challenges about how her statements to police had been obtained. But the evidence, the gun she'd bought, the shooting lesson, the residue on her hands, the impossible angle of the wound, the financial motive, and her own family's certainty was overwhelming. On June 7, 1996, after deliberating only a matter of hours, the jury found Della Sutorius guilty of aggravated murder, along with a firearm charge and drug possession. She was sentenced to the maximum available, 23 years to life in prison. It was at that sentencing that the case earned its most memorable line. The judge, Richard Niehaus, pushed back on the Black Widow label the press had given her. She reminded him, he said, less of a black widow than of a lionfish. A creature that draws its prey in with its beautiful, striking appearance, then kills with the venom hidden beneath. It was a fitting image for a woman who had used charm and a web of invented accomplishments to work her way into a wealthy man's life, only to end it for what she stood to gain. Della Sutorius served her sentence at the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville, and she would never be released. On November 20, 2010, she died of NACHU, rel causes, at the Franklin Medical Center in Columbus, Ohio, at the age of 60, a few years short of her first parole eligibility. For Daryl Sutorius's children, who had watched their father grow afraid inside his own home and then lost him to the woman he'd hoped would be his companion, the case stood as a lasting reminder that some of the most dangerous people are the ones we invite closest. Donna Roberts, 2001. On the night of December 11, 2001, in the quiet suburb of Howland Township near Warren, Ohio, a 57-year-old businessman named Robert Fingerhut came home from work and was ambushed inside his own house. Fingerhut, who ran Greyhound bus terminals in the Warren and Youngstown area, was shot in the kitchen and left dead on the floor. When investigators arrived, it might have looked, at first, like a burglary that turned deadly. But this was no random break-in. The man who pulled the trigger had been let into that house as part of a plan that had been worked out in extraordinary detail in nearly 300 letters and dozens of recorded phone calls. And the person on the other end of that correspondence, the person who stood to collect on Robert Fingerhut's death, was the woman he had once been married to and was still living with, Donna Roberts. To understand this case, you have to understand the unusual living arrangement at its center. Donna Roberts and Robert Fingerhut had been married years earlier, and though they had divorced back in the 1980s, the two continued to live together in the Howland home. Their finances stayed intertwined as well, and that detail would turn out to be lethal. Robert carried life insurance policies that named Donna as the sole beneficiary. If he died, she stood to collect a substantial sum, reported at more than $500,000. On paper, Donna Roberts had every reason to want her ex-husband alive and well. In reality, she had 500,000 reasons to want him gone. What tipped that motive into murder was another relationship entirely. Donna had begun an affair with a man named Nathaniel Jackson. By 2001, Jackson was behind bars, serving time for an unrelated offense. And it was from inside prison that the plot against Robert Fingerhut took shape. Separated by prison walls, Donna and Nathaniel did what many couples do to stay close. They wrote letters and they talked on the phone, but their correspondence wasn't only affection. Woven through it was a scheme, a running, evolving conversation about how to kill Robert Fingerhut and build the life they wanted on the insurance money his death would bring. What neither of them fully grasped was that the prison was recording those phone calls and that the letters would one day be read aloud in a courtroom. Jackson was released from prison on December 9, 2001. Donna was there waiting to pick him up. And just 2 days later, on December 11th, the plan they had put down on paper became real. Investigators determined that Jackson made his way into the Howland home, a home he'd been given access to, lay in wait, and ambushed Robert Fingerhut when he returned that night, shooting him and leaving him dead in the kitchen. In the aftermath, the evidence pointed to just how deliberate this had been. Beyond the letters and calls, investigators said Donna had helped equip Jackson for the crime, providing items like a mask and gloves for him to wear. The unraveling came quickly, and it came from two directions. The physical trail led to Nathaniel Jackson within days. On December 21, 2001, he was arrested at a friend's house in Youngstown, and when police searched the home, they recovered a pair of blood-stained gloves, notably missing the left index finger, along with other evidence tying him to the scene. Jackson himself, at the time of his arrest, had a bandage wrapped around that same left index finger, but the heart of the case against both of them was that mountain of paper and recordings. Investigators recovered roughly 19 monitored phone calls and close to 300 letters exchanged between Donna and Nathaniel while he was in prison, a written and recorded record of two people planning a murder in their own words. It is rare for prosecutors to be handed anything so damning. In this case, the conspirators had essentially documented their own crime. Donna Roberts and Nathaniel Jackson were tried separately, both for the murder of Robert Fingerhut, and both cases were overseen by the same judge, Common Pleas Judge John Stewart. The evidence was overwhelming. Roberts was convicted of aggravated murder and related charges, complicity in the killing, the burglar, and the robbery that the law folded into the crime, and in a punishment that set her apart, she was sentenced to death. With that sentence, Donna Roberts became the only woman on Ohio's death row, a distinction she would carry and fight against for the better part of 2 decades. Nathaniel Jackson was likewise convicted and sentenced to death for carrying out the shooting. But the story of Donna Roberts' sentence turned out to be a long and winding one, marked by repeated trips through the appeals courts. Her death sentence was, in fact, imposed more than once. Ohio's Supreme Court twice overturned the penalty on procedural grounds, including a finding that the trial judge had improperly worked with a prosecutor in preparing the sentencing decision, and later a ruling that potential mitigating factors in her life hadn't been properly weighed. Each time, after the flaws were addressed, she was sentenced to death again. In 2003, again in 2008, and once more in 2014. Through it all, she remained the lone woman awaiting execution in the state, her appeals grinding on year after year while the underlying conviction, the fact that she had conspired to have her ex-husband killed, stood firm. The final turn came from the federal courts, and it came through her co-defendant. In 2024 and 2025, the U.S. Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals took up the case of Nathaniel Jackson and found that his original sentencing had been tainted, that the trial judge's misconduct had improperly kept the jury from hearing evidence that might have argued for a lesser punishment. His death sentence was vacated, and because Donna Roberts' case rested on the same tainted foundation, in May of 2025 the court granted her the same relief, throwing out her death sentence as well. Crucially, none of this touched the verdict itself. Both Roberts and Jackson remained convicted murderers. What was at stake was only whether they would be executed. That question was finally settled in December of 2025, when the sentences of both Donna Roberts and Nathaniel Jackson were commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole. After more than 20 years, Ohio no longer had a woman on its death row, not because Donna Roberts was any less guilty, but because the process that had condemned her to die had been found legally flawed. She will spend the rest of her life behind bars. The case has been revisited many times on television, held up as a stark example of a killing plotted for money and love in equal measure. But the people who knew Robert Fingerhut have never lost sight of what was actually taken. In the years of appeals, his son spoke of Donna Roberts in unsparing terms, calling her manipulative and evil for orchestrating the death of a man who had trusted her enough to keep sharing a home and a life. Everything Donna and Nathaniel wanted, they had spelled out themselves, in ink and on tape, and in the end, that same paper trail is what ensured neither of them would ever go free. Rebecca Auborn, 2022-2023. On January 15, 2023, in the North Linden neighborhood on the north side of Columbus, Ohio, police were called to the scene of what looked at first like one more tragedy in an epidemic that had already claimed thousands of lives across the state. A 30-year-old man named Joseph Crumpler had been found dead of a drug overdose. In a city and a country awash in fentanyl, A death like this could easily have been recorded as one more accidental overdose and quietly closed. But investigators kept pulling at the threads of Joseph Crumpler's final hours, and what they found wasn't an accident at all. Crumpler had been deliberately drugged and then robbed while he lay dying, and the person responsible had done it before and would be tied to a string of nearly identical deaths across Columbus. Her name was Rebecca Auborn, and the state of Ohio would come to describe what she did as serial murder. The pattern at the center of this case was cold, patient, and precise. Auborn, who was 35, would arrange to meet men around the north side of Columbus, offering to meet them for sex in exchange for money. That arrangement, though, was only the setup. The moment a man was alone with her and off his guard, the encounter turned into something else entirely, because the drug she carried was fentanyl, the powerful synthetic opioid at the heart of the overdose crisis. Once it took hold and left the man helpless, she would take whatever she could reach: cash, credit cards, a vehicle, tools, anything of value. What investigators came to believe was that Auborn was funding her own drug habit this way, one victim at a time, and that for the men who didn't wake up, a robbery had quietly become a murder that looked exactly like an accident. Joseph Crumpler was not the first. Investigators would eventually determine that the pattern had begun weeks earlier. On December 13, 2022, a man was drugged in the same manner but survived. That man, later identified as 61-year-old Richard Bixler, lived to become a crucial piece of the case. Then, on January 15, 2023, came Joseph Crumpler's death, and after him, the pattern continued through the spring and into the summer. On April 1, 2023, 54-year-old Robert Snoke of nearby Pataskala died. Less than 2 weeks later, on April 13th, 64-year-old Wayne Aiken from the northeast side of the city died as well. And in the middle of June, on June 17, 2023, 42-year-old Guy Renda of Belpre, Ohio, became the fourth man to lose his life. 4 men dead, 1 survivor, all across a span of roughly 6 months, all connected by the same method and the same woman. What makes cases like this so dangerous is precisely how easily they can hide. Each of these deaths, taken on its own, looked like the kind of overdose that fills medical examiners' reports every single week. There was no obvious sign of violence, no weapon, no dramatic crime scene, just another life lost to fentanyl in a city that had grown tragically used to it. That camouflage is what let Auborn continue for months, but it didn't hold forever. After Joseph Crumpler was found dead in January, detectives questioned Auborn about his death, and she gave them something extraordinary. She admitted that she had drugged Crumpler and that she had stolen from him while he was incapacitated. It was an admission that turned an overdose into a homicide. Even so, she wasn't yet held as a serial killer. That word, serial, would only come later once investigators had connected the deaths that were still, at that point, sitting in separate files. The work of connecting them fell to the Central Ohio Human Trafficking Task Force, working alongside Columbus Police homicide detectives and special agents from the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation. They began systematically reviewing reported overdoses across a specific stretch of the north side, the area around Interstate 71, State Route 161, Cleveland Avenue, and East 17th Avenue, between December of 2022 and August of 2023. As they laid the cases side by side, the pattern sharpened and the other deaths came into focus. Along the way, they tied Auborn to still more crimes that fit the same template. In April of 2023, drugging a man at a Days Inn hotel and making off with his car and credit cards, and that July, stealing more than $2,000 worth of tools from a man's vehicle. Thefts, she acknowledged, saying she'd taken the property to a drug house. Piece by piece, what had looked like a scatter of unrelated tragedies resolved into the work of a single predator. By the autumn of 2023, the task force had built the full case, and it came together formally. Rebecca Auborn was indicted on a sweeping list of charges, nearly 30 in all, including 4 counts of murder, along with counts of involuntary manslaughter, aggravated robbery, drug trafficking, corrupting another person with drugs, felonious assault, and tampering with evidence. At first, she pleaded not guilty, and the case headed toward trial. There was a delay while the court took up the question of her competency. In early 2025, a Franklin County judge ruled that she was competent to stand trial, and the case moved forward. Then, on December 19, 2025, Rebecca Auborn changed course and pleaded guilty. Under the agreement, she admitted to 4 counts of murder, 1 for each of the men who had died, and 1 count of felonious assault for the man who survived. In exchange for those pleas, the remaining 23 charges against her were dropped. The plea settled the central question of guilt and set the stage for the only thing left to decide: how long she would spend behind bars. That answer came on February 19, 2026, in a Franklin County courtroom. The families of the men she killed were there, and some of them spoke. In one of the most striking moments of the hearing, the daughter of victim Wayne Aiken addressed Auborn directly, telling her that no matter how much torment the case had caused, she could not bring herself to hate her, and never would. Judge Karen Phipps then handed down the sentence: 4 consecutive terms of 15 years to life, 1 for each life taken, adding up to a minimum of 60 years in prison before Auburn could even be considered for parole. For a woman in her mid-30s, it is a sentence that will almost certainly keep her incarcerated for the rest of her life. Ohio's Attorney General, Dave Yost, whose office had labeled the case a series of serial killings, said the sentence reflected the defendant's disregard for life and the callousness of killing not just once, but again and again. And that is what sets this case apart, and what makes it so unsettling. Rebecca Auborn didn't need a gun or a knife. Her weapon was the overdose crisis itself, a wave of death so common that her victims could vanish into the statistics, mistaken for accidents, until someone finally looked closely enough to see the hand behind them. 4 men, Joseph Crumpler, Robert Snoke, Wayne Aiken, and Guy Renda, were killed not in a moment of rage, but coldly, for whatever they happened to be carrying. And a 5th man lived only by chance to help make sure the truth came out. 7 women, 7 stories that unfolded across nearly a century of Ohio history, from a poisoned widow on a Depression-era farm to a killer who used the modern overdose crisis as her weapon. Different decades, different towns, different methods. But look closely, and the same thread runs through all of them. Not one of these women fit the picture we carry in our heads of what a killer looks like. They were wives and mothers, a caretaker who smiled at the bedsides of the men she was poisoning, a surgeon's charming new bride, a woman who plotted murder in ink, 1 letter at a time. They moved through ordinary lives: church socials, dating services, custody exchanges, quiet suburban streets, and the people closest to them never saw it coming until it was far too late. That is the uncomfortable truth this state's history keeps returning to. The danger was never a stranger in the dark. It was already inside the house. And behind every one of these cases are the people who paid the real price: the husbands, the parents, the children, the strangers who trusted the wrong person. They are the reason these stories are worth telling carefully and worth remembering at all. So we'll leave it with you. Of these 7, which case unsettled you the most, and which one did you never see coming? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. And if there's an Ohio case you think we missed, drop the name below. It might just be the next video. If you made it this far, thank you for spending this time with us. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's next, and we'll see you in the next one.